One.
Hello, my name is Haroon Akram-Lodhi, and I'm Professor of Economics and International Development at Trent University in Peterborough, Canada. I've been working with UN Women as a policy advisor since UN Women was UNIFEM back in the 20th century. However, in the past 6 years, I've been working in particular with the Regional Office for Eastern and Southern Africa in understanding why small-scale women farmers in the region may be less productive on the plots of land that they operate than men small-scale farmers. In doing this work, we've come to understand that care and agricultural productivity mutually shape each other. In other words, care impacts upon agricultural productivity, and agricultural productivity impacts upon care. Let me try and explain why to you. Agricultural productivity growth is important because it drives growth more generally, as well as inclusive pro-poor poverty reduction, improved food security, and enhanced nutrition. So agricultural productivity growth is absolutely central to the attempt to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. However, poverty is not gender neutral. Women are disproportionately poor, especially in the countryside. Moreover, in much of Africa, men continue to migrate to cities in search of work, leaving women to tend to the farmland and raise the children. In other words, it is unmistakably the case across sub-Saharan Africa that farming is becoming increasingly feminized, and so improvements in women's agricultural productivity is particularly important in reducing poverty, improving food security, and improving nutrition. But it should not be assumed that women farmers have the same agricultural productivity as men farmers. Women and men small-scale farmers do not have the same characteristics. They do not always face the same production conditions, nor do they always make the same production choices. This is because women and men have differences in the ownership and control of resources, and in particular, land and labor. These differences in the ownership and control of resources impact upon what women and men grow, how they grow it, what they do with what they grow, and what they receive for what they grow when they try and sell it. In the 1990s, robust evidence began to emerge that rural female-headed farming households were less productive in their farming activities than rural households headed by a man. In the 2000s, rural feminist economists began to argue that this finding was important, but was not adequate because of the problems associated with the idea of the female-headed household, both in Africa and elsewhere. In the early 2010s, a number of countries in Africa started undertaking what are called integrated surveys of agriculture. These integrated surveys of agriculture identify whether the principal decision makers on individual plots of land are women or men in the farming household. This is true for male-headed households, to be sure, as well as for female-headed households. But it's also true for households that are jointly managed by husbands and wives. This means that these integrated surveys of agriculture identify who makes decisions for specific plots of land on farms jointly managed by husbands and wives. This makes it possible to move beyond the male-headed versus female-headed typology and get a much richer understanding of women and men's roles in small-scale farming. With these surveys in hand, UN Women and UN Development UN Environment's Poverty Environment Action, in conjunction with national government partners in 7 countries and with the World Bank in 3 countries, have undertaken a number of policy studies using this nationally representative data. These policy studies have sought to evaluate whether there are indeed differences in the agricultural productivity of plots of land managed by women when compared to the agricultural productivity of plots of land managed by men. Moreover, these policy studies have sought to identify when there is gender gaps, why there might be a gender gap in agricultural productivity. In 2015, this work was done for Malawi, Tanzania, and Uganda. In 2017, it was then done for Ethiopia and Rwanda. In 2021, the work was done for Zimbabwe. Currently, I'm working on doing this analysis for Mozambique. I won't go into the analytical methodology, but the reason why women plot managers of land might be less productive on the plots of land they operate can be broadly broken down into two domains. First, they may have smaller amounts of land, smaller amounts of other non-land endowments, or have lesser amounts of non-land inputs when farming. Secondly, they may get a lesser return to the endowments and the inputs that they use. If either or both hold, and women's agricultural productivity could simply be increased to that of men's, then agricultural growth should be engendered, poverty reduction should take place, food security should be improved, and nutritional outcomes should get better. So what have we found? Firstly, and very importantly, there is indeed consistently a gender gap in agricultural productivity between women managers of land and men managers of land. The gender gap in agricultural productivity varies from 11% in Ethiopia to 28% in Malawi. This is a measure of how much less productive women plot managers are when they are compared to men plot managers. Now, we can use this estimate of the gender gap in agricultural productivity to then model how the gender gap in agricultural productivity results in what we call lost gross domestic product. Lost in the sense that gross domestic product would be higher simply if all women's plots saw their productivity increase to that of men's plots. What we have found is that lost gross domestic product varies from 67 million US dollars a year in Uganda to 419 million US dollars a year in Rwanda. This is how much gross domestic product would rise simply if women's plots saw their productivity increase to that of men's plots. Finally, we can use the estimate of lost gross domestic product to model how much poverty would be reduced if women's plots had their productivity increased to that of men's plots. What we have found is that over a 10-year period, poverty will be reduced by 800,000 people in Tanzania, but it would also be reduced by up to 2.4 million people in Malawi, which is a lot considering that Malawi's population is around 20 million. So the gender gap in agricultural productivity is real and it is important. The next question then is whether we can identify the proximate causes of this gender gap in agricultural productivity in the 7 countries. Using the data, we can. And we can group what we have found into a set of common themes. Generally speaking, the gender gap in agricultural productivity is a function of 3 things. Firstly, the availability of men to work on women's plots of land. Secondly, men's greater production of higher value marketable crops that are destined to be sold. And thirdly, men's greater use of superior agrarian technologies. So men are less willing to work on women's plots of land, they produce more valuable crops, and they use better techniques and technologies. In 2017, UN Women and Poverty Environment Action looked into the 2015 analysis of Malawi, Tanzania, and Uganda more deeply. The purpose was to triangulate the extent to which the results found in the data were or were not witnessed on the ground. In other words, were the processes seen in the data recognized by women and men plot managers? From this set of studies, 4 common sets of findings were found. The first was that women's responsibilities to provide unpaid care and domestic work in the home and in the community reduced the amount of time that they could devote to their plots. And because labor is the principal input into plot production and productivity, this affected gender gaps in agricultural productivity. Unpaid care and domestic work includes household maintenance, cooking, cleaning and sanitation, care for children and the elderly, home health care, informal education, and water and energy collection. Across the 3 countries, this required between 5 to 7 hours of work a day. Secondly, it was found that women's responsibilities to provide unpaid contributing farm labor on plots of land principally managed by their husbands again reduced the amount of time that they could devote to their plots of land. And again, because women's labor is the principal input into their plot production and productivity, this impacted upon gender gaps in agricultural productivity. Third, women's responsibilities to provide the cash needed to meet their household's money requirements reduced the amount of time that they could devote to their plots because they needed to work for wages or engage in petty trading. And again, because labor is the principal input into women's plot production and productivity, working for wages or engaging in petty trading reduced the amount of labor that they had for their plots of land, and this impacted upon gender gaps in agricultural productivity. Fourthly, gender-based violence reduced the amount of time that women could spend on their plots of land. Moreover, gender-based violence was also used by some husbands to seize control of their wives' cash and crop resources. In effect, husbands were stealing from wives. Now, the two sets of findings of these studies are mutually reinforcing. Consider the most important proximate causes I just mentioned that we found from the integrated surveys of agriculture. The first was that inadequate quantities of male family labor was working on women's plots of land. But husbands were not willing to work on the plots of land assigned to their wives, and moreover expected their wives to work on the plots of land that they operated before any other on-farm operations were carried out. So effectively, husbands are managing wives' labor. As a result, men have shorter working days on the farm than women and focused on their own or on joint plots which they principally managed, from which they controlled marketing decisions and any cash receipts that arose from the market. The second finding from the integrated surveys of agriculture was that men produced higher value crops. But because of their care responsibilities, women bore principal responsibility of providing the food crops for their households, and so didn't, and indeed couldn't, opt for higher value crops. Thirdly, the data showed that men used better agrarian technologies. But women didn't have the cash incomes needed to buy the better agricultural technologies that were available because they had primary responsibility to meet the household cash needs of their household in order to provide care. And thus their household maintenance responsibilities dominated the use of any cash incomes that they earned. So the findings from both sets of studies reflected social norms and values that generated the expectation that the meeting of care is the first and foremost responsibility of women. These same social norms and values resulted in a gender-biased distribution of unpaid care and domestic work, which, along with the expectation that wives work on their husbands' plots or produce male-controlled cash crops on joint plots, produced excessively long working days for women and a lack of time for women to work on the plots of land that they controlled. It thus produced time poverty. These social norms and values are enforced through the use by some men of gender-based violence, which has economic consequences in that it reduces women's labor availability, it reduces women's cash incomes, it acts as a disincentive amongst women to save, and it acts as a disincentive among women to invest, all of which impact upon the agricultural productivity of women's plots of land. So the need to perform or receive unpaid care and domestic work shapes the terms and conditions by which women and men work on the land. We cannot look at working the land in isolation from the distribution and performance of unpaid care and domestic work. So with men's control of women's time and labor, the opportunity cost of the social norms and values that confront women is a lesser capacity to work on their plots of land. This in turn results in gender-based differences in agricultural productivity, which shapes and is shaped by gender-based differences in unpaid care and domestic work and gender-based violence. The care agricultural productivity nexus is, I would suggest, critical in understanding whether or not rural societies in sub-Saharan Africa are changing. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the knowledge sharing.